Technology isn't just a part of our everyday lives anymore. It's become a frontier for global powers, with India right in the mix. So why not join the conversation? Take the Technopolitik Survey, created by researchers at the Takshashila Institution. It's just 10 simple questions, but your answers could help shape India's strategy in navigating the fast changing world of high tech geopolitics. Your voice matters, so let's make it heard. The link is in the bio.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of All Things Policy. I'm Sowmya Prabhakar, Chief Operating Officer at Takshashila Institution. And today I have an interesting person with me. Her name is Bhumika. Bhumika Modh is somebody who's managing policy research and coordination at the Association of People with Disability. And I thought there were a lot of things happening around where I read about some changes from the legal side of things. And I thought it would be good to get somebody who's done deep work around it to have a conversation with us. Before we get started, also wanted to quickly tell people that our GCPP program begins soon. And the application deadline is 3rd January. And looking forward to have more people who are listeners on this podcast to join us for the upcoming cohort. On this note, welcome Bhumika to All Things Policy.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Soumya.
Okay, so we're talking about a subject that I think a lot of times we see around us, or we kind of maybe have friends and family members who are going through struggles, especially people with disabilities. But I feel a lot of times we use different jargons. Like Bhumika, I was already telling you, especially abled or a disabled person kind of conversations happen. So one, I would like to have you give us a primer on what does it really mean when we say people with disabilities, and an appropriate term to be used so that that's more acceptable.
Sure, Soumya. I think that's an excellent question, and it's very pertinent, especially considering that we are now walking towards a more inclusive society. So, when we talk about a person with disability, we should refer to people as people with disability, because the intention here is to keep the focus on the person rather than the disability. So when you say disabled person, the disability comes first. When you say a person with special needs, you are in a way patronizing them. When you say person with who is differently abled, again it's a sense of patronizing that you are trying to exhibit. So the rule of thumb is to just say a person with a disability, so that the person is given the predominance rather than the disability that they carry.
All right. Okay. So we'll use that throughout the conversation as well. So to begin with, I use the framework, the Samaj Sarkar Bazaar, and I feel it nicely fits into the overall arc that we are trying to achieve via this conversation. So picking up society as the first step, right? Bhumika, where do you think society plays a role in ensuring we have a conducive environment, or even amplifying certain voices, right? Because a lot of times we have seen that when there's a lot of noise about things, when people write about it or share about it vehemently, or even I don't know, there are different ways that people sign petitions and all of it, we see some things moving. So do you see a role that the society can play in addressing this?
Of course, I think the one of the biggest ways in which the society can actually play a major role in ensuring inclusion is by removing barriers, and it can be infrastructural barriers, it can be attitudinal barriers, and the first, I would say, stepping stone for that would be to inculcate a habit and a feeling of empathy rather than sympathy. So when you have a feeling of empathy towards a person with disability, you not only look at them as a person who is vulnerable, but you understand the kind of struggles that they might have, and then you make decisions based on the experience that you then feel. So, for example, if you have a person who has a visual impairment and you think, okay, how is that person going to navigate through the footpaths? So when you are running a campaign about safe footpaths in a city, then you should also, it would be ideal to also inculcate what it would mean for a person who also has a visual impairment. So these kind of things, having a sense of empathy, I think, is core when it comes to how the society can actually take an initiative.
Yeah, yeah, totally. And I feel a lot of instances, sometimes people are born with this. In certain instances, it happens due to an accident or any such situation, right? So I feel the family, of course, gets educated in some sense, right? You see a lot of households which have probably a railing, less of friction inside the house itself, because I don't know if you still have houses which have mezzanine floor kind of an thing where there's a step. So I know that by design, a lot of people today are looking at having homes with less friction, so that not just for people who are with disabilities, but also elderly care and even children, the safety kinds of steps in with that, right? I mean, less number of accidents and fall and all of that. So are there initiatives that you're familiar with where the community has come together to solve for this, or do you have good examples there?
Sure. I think one of the many initiatives that has been taken is, of course, when it comes to infrastructural modifications. So of course there are, when you talk about accessibility, there are two ways you can make changes to your infrastructure. First would be to inculcate planning and a plan for universal design, which would inevitably have braille signboards and lifts, escalators, and all of the infrastructural requirements for a building to be accessible. And then, of course, you have retrofitting, which means, as you were saying, older buildings which are not so-called modern with lifts and elevators and have stairs before lifts. So retrofitting would essentially mean changing that landscape so that it becomes more accessible. So there are many examples, many people who are, who are invested in this kind of initiatives, where not only are the lives of people with disabilities made easier, but also, as you said, the elderly and people who have young children, who is someone who is maybe temporarily injured. So a lot of people would benefit from an infrastructure that is more accessible and inclusive by design. So even as as the entire disability community, we all always try and make a case to include accessibility at the planning stage rather than retrofitting, because it's also time consuming and quite expensive to break something that's already been made.
Totally. No, I agree, because at my workplace as well, the one way we could kind of fix this kind of challenge was to get something by Ramp My City. But I know that a lot of times it's, just the construction and say heritage building I was talking to you about, right? I'm sure a lot of people, however their lives are, would like to kind of engage with art, maybe historical monuments, but there is no scope for kind of them having that experience at all. And I know we did touch upon MAP as a good example, which is Museum of Art and Photography in Bangalore, which allows for this, right? Which has been designed in a way very thoughtful that it covers the ground in terms of making everybody inclusive in the plan. But just to go about a little more on education institutions and corporates itself, right? So I had an instance where a dear friend whose son actually in his sleep walked from their duple home into the stairway and actually had a fall, and his spinal cord injury led him to kind of be on the wheelchair for a lifetime. So I know that they moved from Bangalore to Kolkata because they didn't have an education institution that could support the infrastructure that was required for him to navigate by himself. So are there places which you have seen which are already aligning to this kind of an aspired goal, though it shouldn't have been that. But are there any examples there, Bhumika?
I think the biggest example, and I think the most celebrated one, is IIM Bangalore. And again, it made extremely accessible because one of their students, as in the case that you have mentioned, one of their own students succumbed to an injury and was had a spinal cord injury, due to which he became a wheelchair user for his entire life. So I think infrastructurally, unfortunately, what has happened is when the need arises, people realize, yes, we should make these accommodations. And which I feel, though, I mean, where we should give credit where it's due, but I feel it shouldn't be left to a situation where you have a student or you have a faculty who needs that requirement. It should be something which is in your mind at all times. So, like, for example, a wheelchair accessibility is one thing, but then you also have accessibility from the perspective of a person who has an intellectual disability or who has a hearing impairment.
Yeah.
So accessibility in those things aren't always as expensive as, installing a ramp. It's usually more pertaining to skill development of the people, and more tolerant and more inclusive behaviors of the people around them. So not every inclusion and every step towards inclusion has to be very complicated. It actually can be very, very simple. Just hiring like a sign language interpreter, or maybe having a separate room for a person who's on the autism spectrum, for them to sit quietly and not be overstimulated by classrooms. Small adjustments like this can actually help all people have a much more fulfilling and an independent life.
Totally. And in fact, I don't know if you visited Anna Centenary Library in Chennai. Have you, Bhumika?
No, I haven't.
Okay, that's one place where on the ground floor they have a system where most books are in braille, and you can also have an assistant who will volunteer if they want them to be read, like if the book has to be read out. So people come and spend time there. So I had visited the place out of curiosity, and I was quite impressed seeing the whole infrastructure and the way they operate. And there were quite a few people accessing the library. It was quite interesting to see. It's made in a way that everybody is around the setup. Somebody is volunteering time, somebody is just accessing things. Like you said, it's already available in a medium that is conducive irrespective of who they are, and it works beautifully. Nice. So we'll kind of dwell into the Sarkar segment, right? So in the past, we have had the RPWD Act, right? Sometime in 2016, if I'm right.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Okay. So can you like call out like what were the gaps that were there, and then we'll get into what's like the recent thing that has come up. We'll talk about it.
So, on the basis of the work that I have been doing, what we have realized as an organization as well is that there are two things mentioned in the Act. I think this is the most glaring thing that I would say is problematic in the drafting. One is that there is a differentiation of two terminologies between reasonable accommodation and accessibility. So, by definition, the word reasonable accommodation means making changes in the current system to accommodate a person with disability and their needs. Whereas
Okay.
accessibility would mean making the entire landscape or the infrastructure more inclusive by design, not when a person needs it, but by design. So this is, I mean, tying into what we were talking about earlier. The law itself says give preference to reasonable accommodation rather than having accessibility as a policy, which I think is has been a huge hurdle to be able to cross. And I think the recent developments that have been happening actually have helped remove this differentiation and put in place something which is more mandatory in nature. So I would say that would be one of the biggest hurdles in implementation of the act. One more which I would like to talk about is the definition of disability and the lack of data regarding disability. So when in any kind of policy making process, I mean, you need to have access to relevant, updated, disaggregated, preferably data. And the
Yeah.
problem with disability is that there is no data whatsoever on how many people in India live with a disability. The National Family Health Survey also, the round six, they had disability as one of their data points, but they had to remove it on the last stage. So, in terms of policy, the Act also did not in any way aid or encourage or enable the process of data collection for what it means to have a disability. Because, yes, of course, it does define disability as, categories of 21 types. All that is a very medical definition, and the entire process of being identified as a person with disability also is slightly confusing in the Act at the moment. So I think that really impacts the whole dialogue on policy and what it means to make provisions for a person with disability.
Got it. So, in the recent developments in the accessibility space, especially after the Supreme Court's important judgment, right, on November 8th, 2024, it was directed by the central government to establish like mandatory standards for persons with disabilities. And I think within 3 months, there should be an audit and an effort done to kind of populate that data. So, can you kind of go in a little more detailed way to kind of share with all of us as to how does this look like and where do you see this will head?
Sure. So the best way of explaining any judgment is usually in a story. So let me take the privilege to do that. So this petition was filed in early 2000s by a gentleman called Rajiv Raturi, who has a visual impairment, and he filed a PIL in the court saying that the public transport and public spaces are not conducive for people with visual impairments. And after he filed that PIL, there were multiple orders which the court gave. The most prominent one, which is important and relevant for the discussion, is the one in 2017. And that order basically gave directions to all the states and gave 11 action points saying that all the states of the country should come back with their current reporting on what is the accessibility implementation and standards in their respective geographical areas and what they plan to achieve in the next 1 year or 2 years. The court at that time had given a period of time to get back to the court with all the reports. None of the states actually responded, and nobody filed any report on the status or progress. So, what happened after a couple of years? The court then, in November 2023 and January 2024, what the court said was that now that the states are not responding, we now offer this opportunity to the sector to give us a status quo or a status update on what exactly accessibility is right now in the entire country. So they directed an organization called Center for Disability Studies in Nalsar, Hyderabad. And they said it is the task of that organization to coordinate with all the stakeholders from across the country and submit a report based on those points which they had originally asked the states to do. So this entire process took a couple of months, and in June 2024, the Center for Disability Studies consulted with over 50 organizations across the country and compiled a report. APD was one of the people who contributed to that report as well, and they submitted an exhaustive report on what is the status of accessibility in India. Based on that report and the data that was presented, the Supreme Court on in November, as you pointed out, passed and issued a judgment, and the judgment basically said that all accessibility standards right now are written in a format which are mere recommendations or guidelines. None of them have any kind of enforcing mechanism. None of them are written in the way that it should be a mandatory element, including
Okay.
the way the law is drafted. So the court then said that the directed the central government within 3 months of passing the judgment, they have to come up with something called the minimum accessibility guidelines. So they have to come up with, the central government along with the Center of Disability Studies, they have to come up with a minimum set of guidelines which are non-negotiable when it comes to implementation of accessibility. So that is the process that is ongoing at the moment. All these
Okay.
organizations are deliberating and coming up with those minimum accessibility standards and then submitting it as one group to the Supreme Court.
So, given this kind of a context, right, and also alongside, I think, the Sugamya Bharat Abhiyan, right?
Yes.
The other policy recommendations to make accessibility a reality in some sense. So, do you have some inputs around it? And I also see that you have worked, or rather, your work in progress for the Yes to Access project, right? There is some app used to kind of track all of this. Bhumika, can you kind of
Yes.
take us through a little bit on that? Yeah.
Absolutely. So the Accessible India campaign, Sugamya Bharat Abhiyan, was launched along the same time when the new RPWD Act was enacted in 2016-17. And there are multiple initiatives under the Sugamya Bharat Abhiyan and
Okay.
relating to employment, inclusive education, um, self sustenance, entrepreneurship within the people with disabilities, and multiple things. So there are a lot of initiatives that the government undertakes under that campaign. The campaign that right now we are working on with them is using the app that APD has developed called Yes to Access. This app, what it does is it does a accessibility audit of a public space. Now, this obviously brings the question, what is an accessibility audit?
Yeah.
So, like you have financial audits of organizations and businesses, you have an accessibility audit which checks the parameters of a building to see if they're accessible for people with disabilities or not. And
Okay.
usually that list is very long with over 300 plus points, data points, which is then conducted by a group of people and over a couple of days, usually, if the premises is pretty big. And then there is a report which is made with a list of recommendations on how you can make your place more accessible. So the whole process is, first of all, time consuming and quite expensive, to be very honest. But the issue that we realized as an organization at APD was that this data doesn't really reach anywhere after the audit has been completed. So the person with disability doesn't get to know whether that place is accessible for them or not. So we tried to build a solution, a technology solution for this gap in information as well. So, what our app does is it has two interfaces, two user journeys. Number one is where a person can use the app, which is based on computer vision and AI, to assess the accessibility features of a location. So, for example, if you take the phone, you open the camera through the app and point it towards a ramp, it will identify if there is a ramp present or not. The next step would be if you place the phone on the ramp, it would then assess what is the angle of the ramp and then let you know if the ramp is then accessible or not, if it is safe or not. So, similarly, there are multiple parameters that we have limited the whole 300 plus list to. And based on those audits, it then generates a score like you have on your food delivery apps and your travel apps. You have scores of certain buildings and locations. Similarly,
Yeah.
we give an accessibility score. So the second user interface is basically of the person with disability. So the map feature allows a person with disability to navigate through what locations near me or where I want to go have accessibility features which are relevant for me. So
Okay.
now not only is the audit done, also that information is now given to people with disability who can now plan their travel and their um, day, identify. So if I'm a person in a wheelchair, I will know if there's an accessible bathroom in that location. If not there, where is the nearest accessible washroom? If there is no accessible washroom, that means I need to make alternative arrangements. Either I need to stop drinking water from a few hours ago, or I need to make alternative arrangements in terms of taking someone with me to help me, and so on and so forth. So that's
Got
what the Yes to Access app does. Now, pertaining to the Sugamya Bharat Abhiyan, what we are collaborating with the government on is we are trying to use this app to conduct accessibility audits of the most frequently visited and popular locations across all the cities of India. And based on those audits conducted by the volunteers of the government, those scores would then be fed into our database and then
Okay.
would be used by the government to identify where there is a gap, or where there is a need for supplementing of any kind. So the volunteers that the government has identified to use the app are also people with disabilities. So it gives like a double legitimacy to the entire process of accessibility audits, that not only are you using an AI computer based vision app, but also people with disabilities are going to be using it to assess accessibility across cities. So that's the collaboration that we're working on. And I think it is going to be instrumental in using the data that comes from it to understand exactly where we stand as a country when it comes to accessibility in public spaces.
All right. So I have a few leading questions from there. So, as an individual, if I have the app on the phone, can I contribute to this list or do an audit, or it's limited to certain people who can report any of the shortcomings of it?
It is a crowdsourced app, which means
Okay.
anybody can download it. We actually recommend that everybody downloads the app, and when you're at a restaurant waiting for a friend to join, or you're at a movie theater and you have some time before the movie starts, you can do an audit yourself. You don't
Oh,
have to complete the entire parameter list for it to be a complete audit, because we also understand that not every place will also have all the parameters. So
okay.
anything that you're able to contribute is one step towards the ultimate goal. So it is open for everybody to download and use. It is a digital public good. There is no financials associated with it whatsoever.
Okay. Now, similar to, how this audit happens, like there are fire audits that happen, right? And there are financial audits that happen. So, is there by law a way that, one has to report back for these things, or we are in a phase where we are too early for it?
When you say report back, what exactly do you mean?
Say in compliance, you have compliance reports, right? For finance, you have yearly compliance statutory things that you need to follow, or you need to do your fire audit so that your infrastructure in some sense is compliant to everything to do with fire exit and stuff like that. So similarly, my question is, if we want compliance, like for the rainwater harvesting, few years back it became mandatory that any building that was constructed after, I can't really recall the exact year, but after that particular threshold, people have to ensure that you implement rainwater harvesting so that water table improves, and everybody started following it because there was a penalty attached to it. So if there are upcoming buildings, is there a way that the system tracks compliance to making sure people with disabilities are able to access it, or is it something that still is in the nascent phase?
So actually, under the RPWD Act, Section 40 mandates that every building that is constructed should not be given a certificate of completion till they meet the accessibility standards.
Okay.
Sections 40 up to 44 are actually explaining this entire concept, and that the government will make rules on what constitutes accessibility standards as well.
Okay. But right now, is it done in a systematic way where there's a penalty or anything that the person is liable to pay if they have not met the standards?
So by law, again, the act does have a penalty section as well, where if you do not comply with the standards, you have a fine of 10,000 rupees, and then of 5,000 rupees, and then if you repeatedly do not comply, it can be up to 5 lakhs. But the question here actually is a little more nuanced. It's not just meeting accessibility standards, because if you have to look at the law and what the law mandates, it, yes, of course, does mandate that you have to have meet these standards, but then what those standards are have been always so exhaustive that it becomes complicated for anybody to actually implement completely, which is why the judgment on 8th November is extremely, extremely important, because it gives you the option to be able to have a minimum limited number of things that you have to have in your building to make it accessible.
Oh,
So,
okay.
yeah.
Interesting. But are there government offices and other, like especially government offices, right? Like if people want to go for their pension or anything to do with interactions where they need to step into a building like that, do you see a better compliance rate?
Unfortunately, I don't at the moment. However, in the past 2 years, what we have seen is there is a growing voice being heard about accessibility, especially with the influencers and the social media content creators, where if anything goes wrong, like for example, a few months ago there was a news on a lady who wanted to get her marriage registered, but she was a wheelchair user and the marriage registration office was on the first floor of the building and there was no lift. So she had to be carried by her husband to the office, physically carried and then signed and then brought back. And she made some noise about it on online, and it was taken into account and it was noticed, is what I can say. How much of it is actually implemented? I think we still need to see how much we can actually track in terms of implementation. I don't think there is an answer or anyone can give you an answer on those parameters specifically.
So, if we look at the market side of things, right, are there enough jobs for people with disabilities? Like, I'm not even talking about the infrastructure in terms of them being employed and having a job which gives them a salary and all of it, right? So, are there enough avenues for people, or do you see a huge gap there?
So I think this it's a very interesting question, because there are two sides to look at this. There are two ways. One is from the perspective of a person with disability, and one is from the perspective of the employer. Usually, now what we are seeing is the entire DEI industry in the corporate world is picking up, and they are very keen on hiring more people with disabilities, which I think is a welcome step. However, what I have seen is it becomes more tokenism than genuinely hiring a person with disability. Right. So what we see is, yes, people are hiring. There is a place. But again, the whole concept and the whole question boils down to, are you hiring them because they have a disability, or are you hiring them because they're qualified?
Hmm. Hmm.
I think that's where we need to understand and introspect that why are we hiring people? Whether or not they have a disability, how much should that weigh on your decision making? So, if I have a person with a disability in my team, me as an individual, as a manager, or as the CEO, should be in a position to say that yes, I am, developing a conducive environment for that person to grow, and I'm providing sufficient support. So when you talk about hiring and workplace adjustments, I think it's a little bit more than just whether there are jobs available. Even if they are, the hiring process and the intention and the aftermath is something we should look at holistically.
Interesting. I think it's also for employers to kind of nurture the conversation in the direction of not just thinking that hiring for a position and you're done with it, but to look at growth and give them enough aspiration to grow, and also give it a chance in terms of a lot of organizations may not have even experienced a situation that way, right? You're new to figuring out how this will pan out, but then just the intention, or rather action, in making sure that a person with disability is hired means a lot of things might get corrected in the system.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the biggest problem of when it comes to policy making or even any kind of government based decision is that there's a lack of visibility of people with disability. which is why it becomes problematic to even think that, okay, this is also a sector we need to think about. And I think a lot of it ties up to the fact that I mean, of course, the public spaces are not accessible, but then you are not in touch with people with disabilities as often for you to think that, yes, I need to accommodate or I need to make provision for this person who might want to visit me or work with me in the future.
Yeah, totally. I think that apathy is there in a lot of cases, right? Like, I also see that elderly folks stop stepping out because the infrastructure doesn't support, and they end up, having a fall. And because of lack of reflex, they end up having injuries that are more intense in a way. And the individual stops taking public transport and any sort of access to get to even as simple as a coffee shop, right? Because none of it supports an elderly person to get there, and we hardly see them. If you look around, it's mostly youngsters, people who are fit and fine or have somebody to kind of take them along, that we would see. But by themselves, we would hardly see them around, and that's why I think it becomes all the more tricky for us to kind of action these things out, unless we are thinking about it or working in this area itself.
I absolutely agree with you. And I want to share a small incident which happened
Sure.
in my workplace. So we had recently hired a person with a visual impairment in my team, and me and my colleague, we were discussing about how we can make her workspace more inclusive and accessible for her. And we were thinking ways, okay, should we put labels on certain things? Should we print, get braille prints for where the cupboard is and where the chair is and all of that, and where certain stationery is kept. So we were just trying to contemplate and brainstorm on how we can make it a better place for her to work in. So when she did join, we asked her, how can we make your life easier? How can we make your workplace conducive? Can we print out braille um, labels for like where the pen is kept and where the paper is kept? I think it was a very empathetic question to ask. The response we received was, I don't use a pen and paper, and I think that was very, for a minute, my colleague and I were a little taken aback that this is something which we should have thought about. But we couldn't think about it at the time because we haven't had the exposure to a person with a visual impairment. The fact that she does not use a pen and paper to write completely nullifies the whole point of labeling where the pen and the paper is, right? So I think that was very eye opening for us in terms of understanding how we can make our environments more um, inclusive.
Yeah. But are there, like, other countries might be struggling with similar scenarios, right? So, how is the global scene looking like? Are there countries which are already kind of found the solutioning side of it, or are there good examples, best practices that we could invoke?
I think the response to this would be that most of the guidelines that we have in India right now are based on the best practices from abroad. And I think the most recent thing that we have adopted is the amendment to the RPWD rules that has happened in October. So the new amendment actually says that the unique disability ID cards, the UDID cards, will now have three different color codes on them. Earlier, these UDID cards were issued with a single differential, that is the percentage of disability. Now, after the amendment, the UDID cards will now be issued under three color codes: blue, white, and yellow. And each color would then signify a different level of disability. So I think that is something which we have adopted from different countries. And I think going forward, I think we are adopting a lot of best practices from these countries and learning how we can make our laws and our systems and our policies more thoughtful and more impactful.
Yeah. So you feel that the latest, step has kind of, it leads into making sure that our accessibility framework compares well to the global standards?
I think so, it does. And especially considering that the two developments, first, the judgment, which says you need to have a list of non negotiable standards. I mean, the best way you could start your journey on accessibility, and especially the second point, the amendment to the Act, the UDID cards, I think, of having three categories. I think it's a great step towards collecting data and having an analysis of what exactly is the disability demographic in India, because that will be instrumental in assigning and developing policies so that they're implemented better.
Great. Okay. Sounds like a full circle, right, Bhumika, from getting a primer on what it means to even address people with disabilities to looking at we as a society which has a huge role to play, right, in these things. See, we can assist people, but there is still a dependency. But how would, tweaking the kind of policies we have and also bringing a little bit of tech and everything around it together from the market and the government side of things, we can certainly start looking at the way forward for ensuring accessibility is not something that people have to ask for, right? And it should by default be a feature rather than think we need to fight for it. So I'm hoping this conversation will be such that next time when we connect, we will have more things to quote in terms of saying where we are heading progressively. And I think it shouldn't limit like December 3rd being an international day of persons with disabilities. I feel a lot of times we center actions around the day we celebrate, right? And just the fact that there's a day that we celebrate, which means that there's not enough attention on it otherwise, right? So I think celebrating a day or a month or any of these things is just optics, but look forward to a time and day when this becomes a default and not something that seems very luxurious to have. So on that note, thanks, Bhumika, for being on this podcast. And if you have any closing thoughts, happy to kind of have you share that.
Thank you so much for arranging this podcast. It truly is, a great opportunity for the conversation on accessibility and disability inclusion, because it's very important that everyone has this conversation and everyone keeps these things in mind, because disability is actually something which can happen to anybody, and it is not something which is a temporary condition. It's a permanent medical change in your life. So I think it's extremely important, and I appreciate you for reaching out and having this conversation with me, and I thank you a lot for
Not
giving me the opportunity to explain these things, which I hope sounded, I tried to make them simple. I hope they were. So thank
Yes.
you so much for that.
Yes, yes. Yeah, see, just the fact that people with disabilities are not really visible around us is something for us to dwell on, right? And think that not that they don't exist, it's just that people find it too tedious to navigate through this whole thing. So there's a role that all of us can play, and great that we have had this conversation. Thank you once again, Bhumika.
Thank you so much, Sowmya. Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @TakshashilaINST or our website takshashila.org.in.